So good day, good morning, good evening. My name is Leif Stenberg. I'm the Dean of the Aga Khan University Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations, aka ISMC. And it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you to today's online lecture. It is the first in the 2020-2021 lecture series which centers on sustainability. The lecture series is a joint initiative of AKU ISMC and the Aga Khan Trust for Culture's education program. The Aga Khan Agency for Habitat and the Aga Khan Museum are also organizing partners in this lecture series. Many and sincere thanks to all our partners. And in today's talk, Onno Rühl, General Manager, the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, will discuss the climate crisis and the agency's work in helping different communities. The title of the talk is The Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, Improving Habitats on the Front Lines of Climate Change. Before introducing the speaker, I would like to take the opportunity to advertise two upcoming short courses at AKU ISMC. Dr. Jeff Tan holds a course titled The Challenges of Development in Muslim Societies, an Introduction, and it will begin on the 4th of December. Mohammed Mekdad organizes a course in collaboration with the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and it will be co-taught by Professor Dick Dowse. It is titled Religious Cultural Heritage, Concepts and Issues in the Modern Middle East, and it will begin on December 11. I warmly encourage you all to keep an eye on the AKU ISMC website and register for our newsletter, as we are launching an exciting plethora of short courses, language courses, the summer program and the winter program in 2021. So, today's speaker, Onno Rühl, is the first general manager of the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, AKAH, an agency established in 2016. Before joining the AKAH, he held positions in the World Bank as a country director for Nigeria and more recently as a country director for India. Mr. Rühl holds a Master of Economics from the University of Amsterdam, and he started his career in the Foreign Service of the Netherlands. Mr. Rühl has a long-standing reputation for driving organizational change, building partnerships, as well as experience in emergency responses, natural disaster reconstruction, and in working with a range of development topics. And before leaving the word to Mr. Rühl, there are a few notes concerning housekeeping. After the talk, the floor will be open for questions. Please use the chat and the opportunity to ask questions that is within the GoToWebinar application. We will unmute you and you can ask the question in person. I also would like to remind you that we are filming and recording the talk. So it is with great pleasure I welcome Onno Rühl as the first speaker in this joint lecture series. Usually one say the floor is yours. Maybe it's not so funny, but now the screen is yours. Welcome. Unmute.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Leif. It's really a great pleasure to be here, and I want to thank AKU, the Institute Study of Muslim Cultures, for having us and for partnering with the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat. As you said, the screen is yours. It's we're doing this in unusual circumstances, but it has significant advantages. In fact, I'm giving this talk today, and it seems like I'm in London. Tomorrow part of a webinar with Focus USA, so it seems like I would be in Dallas. And earlier in the week, I was participating in an event in Paris. So COVID is certainly not pleasant, but it does expand in a way what we can do on a daily basis, and that's exciting. My talk today, as Leif said, is about improving habitats on the front line of climate change, and I want to start that by explaining the vision of His Highness the Aga Khan behind the creation of the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat, which, as Leif explained, was created only in 2016, and I have the tremendous honor of being the first general manager of this agency. The Aga Khan Agency for Habitat is actually not a new agency. It is rather a merger of existing programs and agencies of the Aga Khan Development Network, notably Focus Humanitarian Assistance, which had been working for 25 years on keeping populations in South and Central Asia and also larger speaking populations in the Ismaili communities across the world safe from the risk of natural disaster. The Aga Khan Planning and Building Services, which is actually the incarnation of the Ismaili housing boards and has strong capacity in construction and planning, a very engineering-based agency that was mainly active in India and Pakistan before the creation of ACA, as we call the Agency for Habitat. The DRMI, the Disaster Risk Management Initiative, which is a scientific attempt to understand the disaster risk better and be able to build predictive capacities, and the Prince Saladin Aga Khan Fund for the Environment. Now, why did His Highness at the time think of, and he had been talking about this actually for decades, create a new agency of the Aga Khan Development Network? It's a very difficult task to create a new agency, and many people in the existing agencies that I mentioned did fantastic work over the years, won prizes, did excellent disaster response and preparedness, and were well known in the community. Well, the reason is that His Highness, as he expressed it, and he started talking about this from the late 1980s, but he expressed it more vividly and explicitly since 2010, he said that he felt that the risks of natural disaster, the risks caused by the environment, as well as the man-made risks in the Muslim world, as he referred to it, and he was referring in particular to the high mountain communities of South and Central Asia, were becoming not just worse in terms of the impact of natural disaster, but also in terms of their frequency. And then the man-made risk, both of insecurity and increasing population pressure, of course, the latter especially in urban environments, caused people to move increasingly to move their houses to places that are unsafe. Because when land is scarce, that is the inevitable consequence of what happens if there's population pressure. Now, when he expressed this, it's important to note that climate change wasn't nearly as well recognized, I could even say fashionable a topic as it is today. There was, of course, significant awareness. In fact, we'll all remember after the 2000 US election that Al Gore went into another business and had his famous PowerPoint about climate change. But climate change was not a wide accepted and well understood phenomenon. But when we now go back to His Highness' vision behind the creation of ACA, he said specifically that in the geographies where we work, the risk of natural disaster was getting worse and worse to a point where it made life for people not just inconvenient, but almost impossible. And what he was referring to is the threat of climate change, because that is in large measure what causes the risks of natural disaster in especially the high mountain geographies of South and Central Asia, but also in coastal areas to become much bigger. I'd like to stay with the previous slide for a second, please, Trishna. So what is the agency designed to do? The agency's mandate is actually combine what the previous agencies and programs were doing and try to create synergies, both in terms of the skills between disaster preparedness, understanding disaster risk, the science of prediction of disaster risk, engineering and planning, and do that in a way that would work on people's safety. That is very simple. You're safe where you are. People's resilience, their preparedness for disasters. But not just that, because if you focus and plan for people's safety and work for them to be resilient, effectively what you do is you're helping communities, people to be able to survive. Now, that's a great goal. But in fact, if you're born somewhere in the high mountains of, say, Tajikistan, you should just be safe and survive. If you're a little girl there being born, your opportunity to develop yourself, to participate in the labor market, to become a leader, to realize your dreams should be the same as somebody who was born here in Geneva or anywhere else in the world. And therefore, design is focused very much on the fact that understanding risk shouldn't just allow us to plan and work for people to be able to survive, but actually make sure that communities can thrive, do well in the future, and lift themselves out of poverty. And in our strategy, we refer to that as services, because you need essential services to survive. I'll talk about it more as we go along in the talk. And opportunity, because people need opportunity to lift themselves out of poverty. So in the talk today, I will try to explain what this means in practice and how this relates to the larger issue of climate change. First, a bit of geography. As you can see on the slide, we are working in the countries that are blue on the slide. Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Pakistan, India, and since this year also Syria. We are moving into working in the Kyrgyz Republic, and we've done some small things in East Africa, but those things are planned for the future. Our main area of focus, by largely speaking, is South and Central Asia, and in particular in the mountain areas. Now, I want to come to climate change, and when we speak about climate change, there's a few things to keep in mind. All of you now, of course, know that climate change is an important problem. All of you know that we need to do something about it. Since last week, may I say, even the most powerful country in the world knows that again, although we're still in a transition of power, but President-elect Biden has already spoken extensively about wanting to rejoin the Paris Accord and fight climate change. What people know less is that climate change isn't actually something that might happen or will happen in the future. Climate change isn't something that we can stop. We can slow it down. We can limit the effects. But climate change actually has already happened. And this is most visible, as we all know, on the North Pole and the South Pole. And we get lots of news about what is happening in the Arctic, what is happening in Antarctica, how the ice is melting. We see spectacular pictures of icebergs breaking off gigantic swaths of sea ice in either the North Pole or the South Pole. And this worries us. It worries us also because iconic species live in both these geographies. The North Pole, the iconic one is obviously the polar bear, a species which has become almost the poster child for the fight against climate change. In the South Pole, all of us will remember seeing the fantastic pictures of the emperor penguins and how they're important. We see whales and other animals, albatross. We see the threats in terms of iconic species being threatened. There is, however, another ice field on the planet, and you can see it on screen. The picture you see is a picture of the Himalaya, Hindu Kush, Pamir, Karakoram, and Tibetan Plain. And this is often referred to as third pole. It's actually geographically quite large, although not as large as Antarctica or the Arctic. And it holds the third largest volume of ice in the world. And that's some people have started calling it the third pole to draw attention to it. This is important because this is in fact the water reservoir for most of Asia. Before I get there, I want to highlight one important issue about this particular pole, if we can do that, which is that it is also inhabited by an iconic. And many think I'm referring to the yak or the yeti or the snow leopard. In fact, with the exception of the yeti, which is a species, of course, in list, the other two actually do live there. But the iconic species that's right with the eye, the third pole, is human species itself. People live in these mountains right near where ice breaks off, melts, lakes form, and lots of things happen that make the very environment in which they live unstable. And that is why the title of my talk is referring to the front lines of climate change. Just like islanders on the Maldives, I think many of you have seen in the past the Maldives cabinet holding a meeting underwater to emphasize how threatened the country was by climate change. Coastal areas are a front line of climate change, but the other line of climate change are the high mountains. And that is where we work. Now, the high mountains are not just the front line of climate change, and this ice is not just important for the people who live exactly on this ice. This ice cap, the Himalayan ice cap, which is a vast quantity of ice, actually feeds a large number of rivers. And it would be great to get that slide up again, because I don't currently see it. But there you go. We've all heard about the Yangtze, the largest of them, the Ganges and the Indus. These are humongous rivers, but even the Mekong, the Brahmaputra, and then a number of smaller rivers, although the Yellow River isn't exactly a small river, all these rivers start on what I've called now the third pole. And the numbers next to the rivers that you see are the number of people who live in that particular river basin. So if you add that up, you'll realize that the Himalayas are the water for almost 2 billion people, all the way from Afghanistan to Eastern China. 2 billion people are dependent on this third pole for their water. So when you think of that, then you realize that this third pole, smaller as it may be compared to the real poles, the North and the South Pole, first of all, puts humans at risk on the frontier of climate change itself, because this third pole is a human habitat. It also puts other species at risk, by the way. And it is rapidly changing reservoir that is melting, which means depleting over time, that feeds and assures water security for 2 billion people. Their drinking water, their agriculture, the water they need to stay clean, including now, of course, to wash their hands and stay safe from epidemics and pandemics. It is a tremendously important issue, and that's therefore the issue I wanted to talk to you about. So the ice in the north and in the third pole is obviously glacier ice, and I think many of you know that glaciers are melting. And here in Switzerland, there's a lot of ado about this. In fact, people have organized funerals for glaciers to emphasize how serious the situation is. In the Himalaya, the glaciers are much bigger, but the situation is not less serious. Here you see a picture of the Darkot Glacier in northern Pakistan and its lake. The top picture is 1991, the bottom picture is 2015. At first glance, you think, not very different. It looks like it's almost the same shape. So first of all, if you see the lake, which is the darker blue little feature on both pictures, you will see that the lake is much bigger in 2015. In fact, the lake size has increased from 40,000 square meters to 150,000 square meters, almost more than triple the size. At the same time, glacier, the nice light blue turquoise color is actually clean ice. The green color is debris-covered ice, the moraine that you'll often see on the at the bottom of a glacier, the tongue of the glacier, as I used to call it, has the same shape. But in fact, in the 24 years that is spanned by this picture, which, by the way, almost exactly corresponds to the time I spent at World Bank. In that single World Bank career, this particular glacier, a vast glacier, got smaller by 26%. It lost 26%. In the 1.5 degree world, the Paris Agreement is fighting to keep, but probably, unfortunately, won't succeed. A further 36% of this glacier will disappear, and under the current emission scenarios, a further 6%. Almost nothing will be left. This glacier is a reservoir. The reservoir will become smaller. In the immediate, what is even more shocking and scary is that lake. And therefore, I want to talk to you a little bit about the lake and what lakes, because water isn't just a source of life. It is also a source of threat. And it would be great if we next slide. Can we go to the next slide, please? What water does in this environment is, when it's stable, it's fine. It accumulates, snow builds up in the summer, snow builds up in the winter, and then it slowly melts in summer. But glaciers, unfortunately, don't always respond. Remember, in the last picture, the lake got more than 3 times as big. Well, I want to show you some pictures, and it is interesting because it goes to the technological ability of the American Agency for Habitat. This is satellite data that have been pulled by our ACA team to show an incident that actually happened. An area where you wouldn't go very often is Panjshir in the Ganj district in Afghanistan. One of the great advantages of the show we live in is that we now use examples from Afghanistan as much as other countries. Normally, people don't want to go there, but virtually everybody's, of course, happy to go there. And this is an interesting set of pictures. You see on the left top that on the 7th of May 2018, this glacier was happily covered by snow and there was no lake. On the 27th of May 2018, it was still covered by snow. You see a little cloud with zero, so you see that these are actually live satellite pictures, but the red dot where the lake is to form is still nicely snow. There's no. On the 11th of June 2018, weeks later, very clearly that there is a lake. It has formed and it is visible. And the satellite data that it was 0.023 square kilometers. That sounds like a small number. It's a pretty big lake. And only 5 days later, it was 1.5 times bigger. It was increasing. So here you see what glaciers do. Now, how does that happen? Now, there's a number of reasons why lakes form because of what happens to glaciers. Many of you know that glaciers melt and therefore lose water. And obviously, if they lose that water gets up, it can form a lake. What happens is there is a natural dam in the valley that consists typically of ice and moraine, which is essentially debris, that forms a dam. That dam holds up water, that melts, it forms water, it can't pass the dam, and it forms a lake. Could be okay. The only problem is the dam was actually designed to hold anything. It's just there. Also not be stable. So that's one variant, which is what we see here. This lake is at the end of the glacier, down where the glacier feeds a river. What is also possible, and this we see in northern Pakistan recently quite often, is that because of the steepness when the glaciers melt, glaciers are ice rivers, and that means that at the bottom there's water dribbling or flowing. When they melt, the water flows faster and it causes actually the glacier to surge, come forward, rather than to retreat when it melts. And when it surges, the glacier itself can block off the entire valley. When that happens, if there's a stream in the valley, that stream will now be backed up and form a lake. In both scenarios, you have a lake that has a natural barrier that is just there and typically temporary. It's an extremely threatening situation. This was the case here in 2018. And if we can go to the next. What happened on the a few weeks after the pictures that you just saw is the dam that stopped the lake got. What? I'm understanding with my sound, but okay. So I'm sorry. Apparently the sound was away, so I'll go back to this slide. On a few weeks after the slide that you saw, a dam that held back the lake, which, as I explained, was formed out of debris, got unstable. How does it happen? Well, it's essentially simple. The ice keeps melting, the water flows, there's more water, melts the ice that is part of the dam, that essentially takes the base of the dam away, and at some point the dam becomes so unstable that it collapses. When that happens, really bad things happen, because essentially the lake is no longer backed up and it releases. This gets very rapidly, but not one shot. There have been cases where actually literally flowed downhill in one shot. But if you see on the picture here, the one that says 11 July and 16 July 2018, you see how much surface water there was downstream from the lake 5 days later, and that corresponds to a flood. What did it do in this case? It killed people. So that's obviously very bad, but they did do a pretty good job getting people out of their homes, because 500 homes were damaged and destroyed, and 5,000 hectares of land were damaged. Now, imagine what that means for that community. First, the loss of life. Then we have 500 families who are no longer in a home. They have no shelter. It's tough in July. It's impossible in October, because this is high altitude stuff. This lake is about 4,000 meter elevation, and the village downstream definitely above 3,000. It's very cold in winter. And then 5,000 hectares of land. What it means is, where people had a nice pasture or a plot of land where they could grow potatoes, that is now full and dumped full of debris. This is just their crop destroyed. Their land is destroyed. They will not be able to grow or have their cattle graze that year anymore, or maybe year down the line, because this is heavy stuff that comes there. So the community suffers an immediate loss, needs to rebuild their home, and has serious loss of livelihood. That's the situation that is caused by a flood like this. And this is not a flood. But I wanted to show you this one, first of all, because we got good pictures to understand. Because I hope you understand that if we can make and analyze these pictures, we're also capable now of understanding what's going on and develop predictive capacity on the basis of that. Understand how the flow might be, and therefore know which particular area in the village or in the valley is at risk, and help community plan for that risk. Because the one thing about this type of flood, which is called a glacier lake outburst flood, GLOF is the rather plastic name that people use. The one thing to understand about it is it's humanly, technically, physically impossible to stop it. You can only plan for how to deal with it. So this is what the African Agency for Habitat does in this particular area. And we have been doing that under the name of FOCUS for 25 years. So the first thing one needs to do is understand the risk. And what you see here is a disaster response map. This is Yarkun Valley, and a few pictures, because this is an interesting process. To understand what to do about disasters and how to prepare, you first of all need to understand the physical risk of the disaster. And the way we do this is through using satellite data, and recent also drone data. Drones fly lower satellites and therefore provide more details, more detail in the picture and better information. And actual surveyors who are going on the ground and actually physically look at each hill slope above each community. We map the physical risk of landslides, mudslides, debris flows, floods, We also try to map the earthquake risk. That's a different technique because you can't map earthquake risk by looking at satellite data or just looking at hills. That is a more complex, but we do involve it in the mapping. Now that you then understand the risk, it's important to understand that when risk happens, say an avalanche in winter. When an avalanche happens in the winter, typically it is, if it's not cut off the outside world because the road is closed because of snow in winter, it is definitely an area where few people go. And therefore, in order for people to live with this risk and understand and do well, they need to first themselves what the risk is and be able to respond to it. And that's what you see here. In one picture, you see the surveyors. The surveyors actually reach out to the communities and show them what they're, so that the communities themselves can understand the risk, not just looking at a map, but by connecting the map to their environment. And the surveyors actually teach people in the village to understand these maps. Then there is community meetings to discuss the risk, and we organize volunteers in each village. And Yagakani for Habitat has actually mapped the risk in 2,300 villages and communities in South and Central Asia. And 1,800 of them, they've organized volunteer teams of community emergency responders, CERTs, community emergency response teams we call them, who are our first line of response. And these people play a very important role because they are young people from the community. And by the way, many of them, in many cases, half of them are young women, even in Afghanistan. This is something we're really proud of. It's also really necessary because these people are first responders, and culturally speaking, in these environments, first responders who are not women cannot provide first response to women for reasons that are easy to understand. So this mapping of risk and communicating with the community and organizing volunteers builds awareness of what can be done, how the community needs to respond, and the ability to provide early warning system. This is really important because if we just go back for a second and think of that lake. Now, if this valley had a lake like that, and the lake was forming and there was a risk, through having mapped the risk, we know which houses are at risk of that particular flood, because it is possible to model how the lake will discharge and how far that will reach in the valley. And that means that if the weather circumstances are such that there is a threat to the stability of that lake, it is possible to warn people in the community and have them evacuate their homes. You can't save the homes because they are where they are, but you can save the people because they can leave the homes. And in fact, we had a glacier lake outburst flood in Pakistan the same year as the incident I'm talking about in a village called Batswat. And in that particular case, those young volunteers managed to evacuate everybody in the village whose house was at risk. And although 40 houses were destroyed, nobody died. It is possible to save people. How do you do that? By understanding the weather, essentially. It's really important to understand that instability, the ice melting, it happens for a reason. Typically, it's because you see a built-up or there's a lot of rain or the temperatures are high, as Leif said in the introduction, economist, so I'm not the specialist to understand that. But it's easy to conceptualize that something doesn't just get unstable because it gets unstable unless it's a sudden earthquake. Typically it is because it rains, the temperature is high, or we can just see an enormously quick build-up, which means that the opposite is likely to happen, a very quick release. So we operate 88 weather monitoring posts in these geographies in Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and this is a tremendous source of pride. Simple stations, you see them on the pictures here, and they're probably the most important for monitoring avalanche risk. Avalanche is not so famous type of natural disaster because avalanches are pretty localized and small, but they pose tremendous risk for communities and kill many people. Therefore, it's really important that we get the weather data from each of these weather monitoring posts in winter every day. And I'm very proud to say that the last 2 winters, and these are volunteers, the last 2 winters, on average, 95%, in fact, it means 87 out of 88 of these stations reported accurate data every day of the winter. And therefore, we had data we needed to predict what avalanches might happen. And although I have to say it's a combination of good work and good luck, the incidence of death and injury of avalanches has gone back to 0 or almost 0 both years in the job where we work. We're very proud of that. We also monitor the glacier lakes. Actual team members of ours trek to the lakes and look at them, but increasingly, although not in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan and Tajikistan, increasingly we use drones to monitor these lakes. These drones they're not the kind of wedding photography drones that are like a little helicopter. They're more like delta wings that fly. They have cameras and they give us data that supplements the satellite data and allows us to monitor. And this is how, in the recent incidents of glacier surge and glacier floods in Pakistan, we have been able to warn the communities and have them be prepared because we knew that the risk was there and it would materialize. So until now, I talked, and let's go to the next slide, about how you get people to survive, because I was very clear. We can save people, but we can't save their homes if their homes are in the wrong place. So how do you solve that problem? And this is really the vision. Can we go to the next slide, please? The vision behind the creation of the Aga Khan Agency for Habitat. Because if you have data to understand where houses are, which ones are at risk, and which specific physical risk threatens that house, or that powerhouse, or that bridge, or that school, or that health center, or that piece of infrastructure, then you can use the same data to actually make sure that we start building where it is the right place to build, not where it's dangerous. And this we call habitat planning. And this is very important because the creation of our agency has given us the mandate and the vision and the ambition, not just to plan for survival and tell people to evacuate at night so that they survive even though their house gets damaged. No, we are trying to work to plan communities for the future so that they'll be safe. And we do that sometimes by mitigating risk. You see on the top picture, terracing of hill slopes and planting of trees on those slopes, because that stabilizes the slope. Physical mitigation walls, or constructing in ways that is earthquake resistant. But what is very important is where to construct. Start moving people in the community to the places that are safe, helping people understand where they should build their homes, helping planners understand what is a good place for a health center, for a school, for a bridge, so that we move the built environment out of harm's way, and therefore don't have to evacuate because people would be prepared. This is a very difficult challenge. But this is what is necessary to fight the fight on the frontiers of climate change. Because these communities are at increasing risk. The land that is safe is scarce. Habitat is threatened. Many people think, well, that's okay. We can just have people move. They go somewhere else. If in Pakistan, they go to Karachi. If they're in Afghanistan, they go to Kabul. If they're in Tajikistan, they can go to Dushanbe or even Moscow. It doesn't work. As humankind, we need to adapt to climate change in many ways. But it is very important that we protect sufficient viable habitat for people, first of all, to keep living the life they live, because not everybody is a city dweller and not everybody should be. But to protect habitat and thrive in habitat, even if it gets more threatened. If everybody habitat is already threatened would move today, the consequences would be completely impossible to oversee, because it is estimated that 200 million people worldwide already live in habitat that is seriously threatened as a consequence of climate change that has already happened. 200 million people. Well, those of us in Europe who saw what happened when there was 1 million refugees from Syria coming, was it 2015, 2016, I forget now, what that did to destabilize Europe. Imagine 200 million people looking for a new habitat. It is not a viable strategy. We need to work to not just find a nuance with nature, this is very important, but also to learn how to survive in habitats with the new risks there. And of course, we need to work to slow down climate change. But these people in these villages that I'm showing you, it's too late for them. Climate change is already there. We need to work to plan for them to thrive and think about risk in a different way. They need urban planning in their little village, just like Karachi, Mumbai, Beijing, Rio de Janeiro, all the big cities in the world need it. We need that quality of planning even for rural communities. And we at the Afghan Agency for Habitat work on this in many different areas. But today I'm focusing specifically on the rural areas because they are at the front line of climate change. Go to the next slide. It's important, however, to underline that in these mountains, they're not just little villages. There are also fast-growing cities, places like Khorg in Tajikistan, Ishkashim in actually both in Afghanistan and in Tajikistan, but I'm focusing on the one in Afghanistan. Hunza in Gilgit in northern Pakistan, Chitral. These are, we used to call them villages or towns, but they go to 50,000 people in very small areas. So they have urban, and we work these communities to plan for the future in the same way that I'm talking about these villages. And obviously that involves a more sophisticated way of urban planning because of the complexity of these communities, but it is the same approach. Now, a bit about services to allow people to thrive. Obviously, many of these services are provided by our colleagues from the Aga Khan Development Network, the health services, the education service, the Aga Khan Foundation, and the rural support programs. The Habitat itself focuses a lot on safe water and sanitation in every home. This picture is of a young in a tap in her own home. This is not a public tap because our water and sanitation programs insist on providing WH quality drinking water inside every home. This is a very ambitious target, but in fact, in Pakistan, we have provided more than 500,000 people with this quality water, and the quality is still the same. This was always understood to be very important. Water and sanitation, particularly water, is my favorite, actually both together, my favorite service delivery sector. Why? Because the burden of providing water and the cost of bad sanitation falls disproportionately on women. It is therefore the most important service to focus on if you want to improve the future and the capability of young women and girls to contribute to the future of the community, which I believe is the most important predictor for whether communities can lift themselves out of poverty. Typically, the boys follow a path that is similar to the generations before them. It's the girls that can become doctors and nurses and police officers and whatever else they can want to be, to provide that delta that lifts the community out of poverty. Obviously, in 2020, we now all even more understand how important water and sanitation is, because our best protection against COVID and other pandemics is not a mask. Mask is very good. Our best protection is what this woman is doing here. It's washing your hands with soap and water. And therefore, we will continue to focus on actually even more. And I'm very happy that in this lecture series, we will focus on this topic in a future lecture. Moving along, I talked a lot about this fight against natural disaster, this fight on the front line of climate change. But as all of you know, and all of you probably think about even more when you talk about climate change, is how to down climate change. What should we do? There's many people most people are convinced that we need to do something. Many people look like the magic bullet. So they think, okay, if I can find a way to make a Tesla cheap, then I can buy it and I don't have a car, and then I put LED bulbs and I'm kept like my life that way, then I can keep living the way I live and everything will be okay. But those would all be very good measures, of course, but it won't add up to the kind of action that we need to stay within 1.5 degrees, because many people already said we're accepting 2 degrees, but the consequences of that are tremendous. And now that the US is joining the Paris Accord, it might be more ambitious. It's important to understand that the fight against climate change has many, many aspects. And for us, the Agency for Habitat, a very important aspect is construction. Obviously, as populations grows, and we need schools and health centers and all sorts of facilities to have those opportunities, we need to build. Not everybody realizes that construction, and also agriculture, by the way, but I'm focusing on construction today. Construction is a tremendous source of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly through the use of concrete, which I'd like to label an evil substance, because it's very good for building strong and building easy and building a lot. But the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the production, transport, and use of concrete are tremendous. So as we are working with communities to plan better and build infrastructure, public buildings, and private homes in areas that are safe, we are also working to make sure that the way these buildings are built will become radically more green. Means solar, as you can see here. That means using lighter materials, because the cost of transporting heavy materials is very high. Insulation, commonplace in countries, not so common in developing countries, but of course tremendously good for saving energy. You'll see some examples here. Solarization of facilities. One of the biggest sources of greenhouse gases in developing economies is diesel generators. To replace the backup power with solar, you have tremendous benefits. The Account Development Network has actually just adopted a standard for green production, which is called Edge Advanced, which means that whatever we build in the future going forward has to have at least a 40% savings in terms of energy use and emissions compared to what we built before. And that is only the start. I'm happy. Equally, I'm doing a little bit of publicity here, an advertisement that Risto Dikansky, our green construction expert at the American Agency for Habitat, will come back to this lecture series and tell you in detail about what we're doing in this field. It's very exciting. Now, these standards work. A big challenge, obviously, is the people's homes themselves. I talked about where they should be, that they should be safe. They should also be energy efficient. Homes are a tremendous source of energy use, and they should meet the needs of people to do well in their lives. It means the air should not be polluted, the home should be comfortable, and they should be heated without too much energy use, which means insulated. We can go to the next slide. And therefore, we're also running a parallel project with a team of fantastic Ismaili volunteers who are helping us design a set of guidelines where we can help people in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Tajikistan, and hopefully in other countries down the line, build homes that are culturally appropriate and recognizable for these people, but that are modern in terms of health and hygiene, comfort, thermal comfort, seismic resilience, environmental sustainability, and are still affordable. Sounds like a long list of requirements, but in fact, all of this is possible because technologies exist and there's lots of innovation in home building that allows not just some standard cookie cutter 3D printed approach of a house that will be the same everywhere in the world, but building according to certain principles by the communities with some technical assistance to have home and not just in the right place, not just safe, also environmentally friendly, meet their culture needs and are comfortable. We call this the Agra model home, and it's actually a concept because it won't be the same home in every country because homes are contextual, and this is really important for the cultural identity communities we work with and also for the natural beauty of these areas, because in the long run, my dream is that the mountain areas where we work, just like here in Switzerland, will become sources of income through tourism, which is something I like very much. And you may say that's an idealistic goal. I make the point that if anybody would have said 200 years ago that Switzerland would be rich in Europe and the founder of an entirely different new industry in Europe that is now it's by far its largest employer, I'm talking about tourism. If you said that 200 years ago, they would have said crazy, because Switzerland was a marginal country. Mountains were hopeless areas with little prospect, just like people talk about some of the areas where we work. So our ambition working on the battlefront of climate change is not just to help people survive, but actually help them do well and the long term, with a long-term vision over decades and even longer, to build these communities to where they can discover their own niche and do well and thrive and have a future for their community, have those girls who are born there lift their families out of poverty. That is why our agency was created. It's a tremendously challenging and exciting task to work on this, and my entire team is super excited and grateful that we've been given this opportunity when His Highness the Aga Khan created our agency. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.